If you were anything like me and you grew up in the noughties, you'll know there was only ever one car that mattered. The Bugatti Veyron. It was just impossible. It dominated playground conversation. How fast could it go? Could it beat a jet fighter? Even if it wasn't your favourite car. And my favourite car was the 2006 Aston Martin DBS. And if you're about to comment only because James Bond drove it, I would say, look at it. It's like someone ripped the skin off a gladiator's bicep and put it on four wheels. Regardless of personal preference though, the Bugatti Veyron was it. The top trump. The pinnacle of automotive engineering. How was something on four wheels that good? It was just mind-boggling. Now, back in the early 2000s, you might remember VHS tapes were still a thing, even if they were on their way out. And in our house, we had an old 80s documentary called Supercharged that, oddly enough, for lack of a better phrase, charged my imagination, particularly a Bugatti from the previous century. By the standards of the Veyron, it was pretty archaic. It had a hand-driven crank start, the steering wheel was as wide as your arm span, and I'm fairly certain if you gave it a good kick, you'd leave a rather hefty dent in the bodywork. And yet, for some reason, this bright blue, open-wheeled, single-seater from the 1920s really captured my imagination, and I wasn't alone, just about a century too late. First appearing at the French Grand Prix of 1924 in Lyon, the Type 35 Bugatti was a marked departure from what the manufacturer and their namesake, Ettore Bugatti, had produced to that point. The engine, in its initial form, was a fairly standard design for the 1920s, a straight 8-cylinder engine fed by two carburetors, which mixed air from the intake with fuel in advance, producing around 90 horsepower. We'll come back to that later. The big deal for the Type 35 was that it was immensely light. It had an aluminium body on a steel frame and was one of the first cars to use alloy wheels. This did actually bite them in the arse at the French Grand Prix because the wheels and the tyres were a non-standard size and the rubber that Dunlop used to make that batch was defective. Teething problems happen to the best of us. The total weight made up for the standard power output and meant the car could dance through the corners at high speed to top leaf spring suspension. Its road holding became legendary, and with its reasonable price tag, wealthy private enthusiasts, who made up the entrance field of Grand Prix racing at the time, snapped up these cars and won. A lot. For a while. And then the competitors started getting faster, because they were using superchargers. Supercharging was nothing new, but Ettore had always resisted it, saying it was quote-unquote unsporting. However, there might have been a more practical reason than his lofty morals.
Bugatti was a strange mixture of instinctive design ability and lack of technical competence, and he certainly wasn't able to design a supercharger himself. In fact, in the end, he got somebody else to do it for him. But he objected, one suspects, because he hadn't got one available and he would have been handicapped. It was as a result of not having one.
Bugatti did yield, and from 1926, the Type 35 had a root supercharger, upping the engine output to over 120 brake horsepower. What is supercharging? Alongside turbocharging, it's a form of forced induction, which is best explained through simple chemistry and some visual aids. For this analogy, I need you to think of this glass as being like the cylinder in an engine, and for this squash to be the fuel. So that's the fuel in your cylinder. Now, if we have very, very strong squash, then you can think of it as a very rich air-fuel mixture, where the squash is the fuel and the water is the air. If your squash is strong, it means you've got a rich air-fuel mixture. There's more fuel in it than air. If you've got weak squash, which means it's paler, that means you've got a lean air-fuel mixture, which means you've got more air than fuel. The thing is, there is an ideal condition for this, where you have a balance between the air and the fuel. It's what's called the stoichiometric air-fuel ratio. But what would be nice is to overcome the issue that I'm about to have if I fill this up anymore. It starts to overflow. You can't fit more than what is in that glass into the glass unless you change the density, and that's what a supercharger does. The supercharger allows you to add more air, like I'm doing now, into the same volume. So all that that's overflowing into the tray there would actually be staying inside the cylinder. So you can add more air, you can then add more fuel, and you get more power output. Or in my case, just more of a mess. Unlike a turbocharger, which uses exhaust gases to turn the fan, sucking and compressing air, a supercharger is driven by a belt off of the driveshaft, as you can see in this scene from the first Mad Max movie. This does use some of the engine's power, but the supercharger gives back more than it takes. It's nice like that. What a selfless bit of engineering. So, when you look at the F1 grid and remember the 3 keys to any successful Grand Prix car, power, handling and reliability, remember it was Bugatti that did it first nearly a century ago. And if you would like to see some of these vintage Bugattis up close and personal, then head over to the Bugatti Trust Museum at Prescott Hill in Gloucestershire, home of the Prescott Hill Climb Circuit. They're open from 10 AM to 4 PM Monday to Thursday. It's a Cotswold Heritage Centre for all the family. They're a lovely bunch of people and they've got some really exciting cars.